Hello there. My name is Austin Sims, and I am a very obsessed nerd. This is going to be my second video talking about creationism, young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism, and generally pseudoscientific denial of evolutionary and geological science. I'm planning to do a lot more videos about this subject, but I work a full-time job, got 2 kids, play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons with the homies. I got a pretty busy life, so I'm gonna publish them, at a much slower pace than a lot of people who are talking about this subject tend to, like Erica, aka Guts Gibbon, Dr. Dan from Creation Myths. They produce videos at a much higher rate than I, and they're both, I think, higher quality individuals on this subject than myself. And absolutely, if you're watching my videos, you should go watch all of theirs because they're incredible. But I wanted to do this video because one thing a layman like myself can count on when you don't know a subject so well is to go talk to the experts and see what the experts think, and if there is kind of two independent schools of thought, which school has the better experts. And I'll tell you unequivocally, I think evolutionary and geological science have the best experts by far. But we're going to get into the nitty gritty of it and break it down a little bit. So let's jump right in, because while I am going to publish less frequently, I'm going to try and keep my videos shorter and more concise. And, because Erica and them guys, they're covering the details. They got the details. I want to make things, shorter and easier and way more accessible. So let's jump right in. In the evolutionary theory corner, we got a lot of big names. We got Charles Darwin, the father of evolution. His theory of natural selection revolutionized our understanding of biological diversity. We got Charles Lyell, the father of geology. He showed that Earth can develop through natural processes that take immense spans of time to occur. We got Alfred Russel Wallace, independently developed the theory of natural selection, leading to its publication with Darwin. Parallel thought. They both kind of reached similar conclusions at the same time. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he proposed a theory of inheritance of acquired traits, which was later disproven but influenced early evolutionary thought. Thomas Huxley, prominent defender of Darwin's theory, often referred to as Darwin's bulldog. Ernst Mayr, a 20th century biologist who played a crucial role in developing the modern synthesis of evolution. Stephen Jay Gould, prominent paleontologist and evolutionary biologist known for his work on punctuated equilibrium. And there's a lot more people I could put on this list. Like one that I think maybe deserves an inclusion is the lady who, her name is deserting me completely right now. But endosymbiosis is her claim to fame. The idea that evolution can be achieved when one microorganism becomes a part of the biology of another microorganism, like what happened with our mitochondria and our cellular biology. Then in the other corner, we got creationism and intelligent design. We got William Paley, a 19th century theologian who argued for the existence of God through the analogy of a watchmaker. We've got Henry Morris, a leading figure in the modern creationist movement, known for his book The Genesis Flood. We've got Duane Gish, a prominent creationist debater and author. Philip Johnson, a lawyer and legal scholar who advocated for intelligent design as an alternative to evolution. And Michael Behe, a biochemist known for his concept of irreducible complexity, often used to argue for intelligent design. So yeah, we could put a lot more people on this list, Dembowski and Comfort and Hovind. But these are kind of some of the big ones: Paley, Morris, Gish. And you'll notice right away, Paley, theologian, not really a scientist. Johnson, lawyer, not really a scientist. The Morris, an evangelist, not really a scientist. Only really two actual scientists are Gish and Behe, and that's already not looking great for their side of the. But we're going to get into it in the nitty gritty of what makes them not as good as the other ones. And the rubric we're going to use is the following. We're going to grade them on fundamentals, on their understanding and use of scientific evidence in their arguments. If they understand scientific evidence well and they use a lot of scientific evidence in their arguments, they get good grade. Interconnectedness, how well they understand that things like evolutionary biology, geological science, volcanology, oceanography, meteorology, radiometric, how interconnected immunology, all these different things are in the evolutionary tapestry for with people who understand it well and utilize the whole suite of interconnected data pools, getting good scores, and those who separate things and don't really view the interconnectedness getting worse scores. Usefulness. How many lives have your ideas saved? How much suffering has your ideas prevented? How much comfort, health, how much good? What have your ideas been used for? And if they've been used for good things, you get higher scores. If you're not using them so much for good things, you get lower scores. Critical thinking. Have you responded to criticisms about your ideas? Did your responses also get criticized, and did you respond to those criticisms? How well does your argument stand up to critical analysis? And then engagement. That one's an easy one. If you take lots of debates, if you do well in those debates, you're doing a lot of good engagement and you get a good grade. And then lastly, miscellaneous. That one's just for relevant stuff that maybe doesn't fit into the other categories so well. So then the grades, we're going to go with 4 different grades, I think. We're going to, from best to worst, we're going to go exemplary, being the very best, proficient, being second best, developing, being second worst, needs improvement, being the worst. And I'm gonna throw in a special, unique score for especially bad understandings and just for comedic value that I'm going to call womp womp. So let's get started on the evolutionary side of the ring. Darwin. Hopefully we all know Charles Darwin. Fundamentals, the first subject. Exemplary is the obvious score. He created a great deal of fundamentals that we still use today. He coined natural selection, heritable variation, common ancestry, the struggle to exist. We don't include extinction as one of the driving forces of evolution anymore, but I think it's a driving force. And of course, he popularized evolution itself. Next category, scientific evidence. Oh my God, so exemplary, beyond exemplary. On one trip through the forest, Darwin collected over 60 samples of different beetle species, and he wasn't even looking for beetles. Darwin sailed the world making natural observations that are still pivotal today. It really fills me with quixotic glee to think about the idea that he had no idea probably how much impact his ideas would have on the world and still continue to have. Interconnectedness, exemplary once more. Darwin developed evolution using ideas from several disparate sciences, such as geology, and he even used economics. Darwin postulated the existence of genetics, even though he didn't know that's what he was talking about. His own ideas about the subject were something called pangenesis. That turned out to be completely wrong. But he did hypothesize that some unit of heritableness existed, and we now know that unit to be genetics. Usefulness. Exemplary beyond exemplary. Evolution revolutionized biology, life sciences, academia, microbiologists, immunobiologists, geneticists, biochemists, medical professionals, agricultural scientists, meteorologists, conservationists, public health and safety experts, more and more and more. So many people working in vital fields use evolution as a key concept that their work is based around. Evolution and geology end up supporting each other more and more, and they've continued to produce amazing results. For instance, this is one Erica, aka Gutsick Gibbon, talks a lot about: fossil fuels. Our whole fossil fuel industry is based around geology and radiocarbon dating being valid concepts. And as a result, evolution kind of gets fathered in there. It is also a big part of what has to be valid for those techniques that we're using to get these fossil fuels to put in your tank work. Critical thinking, another exemplary. While Darwin was working on his theory of evolution, it's important to know that he did so with a massive handicap. He had no idea how genetic heredity works. Darwinian gradualism is still a powerful and useful working science today, nevertheless. Detractors of his theory have tried for over a century and a half to thoroughly refute him, and have basically failed, according to even the Supreme Court. The last two categories: engagement, exemplary. Darwin engaged in several debates on his theories while alive and responded to criticisms in writing many times. Darwin himself was a theist and obviously accepted evolutionary theory, despite creationist rumor mill nonsense claiming he renounced it on his deathbed. That didn't happen, you guys. And lastly, miscellaneous. Another exemplary. He's the father of evolution. People get tattoos of his face. They put up paintings and posters and artworks all over the world in offices and schools. He figured out evolutionary theory without even knowing what genetics was, let alone how it works. I could go on, but for the sake of brevity, I'll leave it there. Darwin gets exemplaries across the board. So already evolution is looking like their experts they're looking real good. So let's move on to the next one, Charles Lyell. Just as important as evolutionary and geological science in general, but for some reason, he's not as immensely famous as Darwin. For the fundamentals, Lyell had an exemplary understanding of the fundamentals. He developed the idea that explains every geological feature to date, essentially. On the scientific evidence, he's also extremely exemplary. There's no other grade appropriate for explaining every geological feature on Earth, except maybe super exemplary. Interconnectedness, again, exemplary. Lyell saw so many systems impacting geological development on Earth, and Darwin's ideas were strongly substantiated by his own. It's interesting because he had the very old ancient age of the Earth solidly in place before evolutionary theory really started to take hold. So a lot of times you hear creationists arguing about, they've invented deep time as a rescue device. No, the deep time came first. Usefulness. Exemplary beyond exemplary. We touched on this a little bit already, but geology, and especially the concept of geological time, is fundamental to the ongoing survival and development of our planet, as well as the enhancement of mankind's intellect. All academia, geology is critical to resource location and management, environmental stability, predicting future seismic activity, analyzing isotope decay rates, discovering new fields of inquiry. And geological science is the idea of, this deep, very, very old ancient universe with all this deep time is critical to almost every branch of science from astrophysics on down. For critical thinking, again, exemplary. Multiple atomic bombs level, exemplary, if you understand the heat problem. Wink. Thanks again, Erica. Engagement, again, exemplary. Lyell participated in many robust debates on his theory and advocated for and it continued to stand up phenomenally to this day. Again, creationists still have a trillions of atoms bomb-sized problem to fix if they want to contend that it doesn't. Miscellaneous, again, totally exemplary. Geological time revolutionized a giant pattern in science that's yield unbelievable evidence in predictive and explanatory power and usefulness. He is called the father of geology, so he should probably be way more famous than Darwin in my honest opinion, but he gets overlooked for some reason. Not sure why, really. I think maybe it's because the creationists specifically have a hate boner for Darwin. So just the two most important ones, like the two guys, the guy who made evolutionary science and the guy who made geological science, already they're getting exemplary in every category. So I'm not even going to bother grading the rest. You're noticing a pattern here. When it comes to evolutionary and geological science, the people who have developed it understand all the relevant facts, data, and natural observations very well. They develop ideas that have predictive and explanatory power. They support these ideas with evidence, research, tests, and experiments that generate reproducible results. These ideas to continue improve and change in increasingly minor ways that steadily make them more and more perfect and able to explain literally all the evidence. They have use. Unbelievable use. Well, we'll talk about that more in a later video. I want to do a whole video about just how much more useful evolutionary science is than creationism. You might find yourself thinking right now, as I often do, how is this even a debate? These guys understand the facts. They understand them so well. And they say it's evolution and geological science and development that's the answer. So who's even arguing with that? Well, these guys. Let's see how well they do. I mean, surely they must be scoring fantastically in every category, too. I mean, after all, this debate has been going on for 150 years, right? Right? People who know science, and especially creationism, probably know that this is sarcastic foreshadowing. They're going to do bad. So, let's start with Paley. Grading Paley is simple, because he predated evolutionary science. He never even knew what evolutionary science was. He was dead and buried before evolutionary science was something on the lips of academic, university academic departments all over the world. He was, maggot food by then. He never learned about it. So pretty much only has one rating category. Rating him in anything else kind of unfair because you never even learned about it. And that category is miscellaneous, which has basically one point: the famous watchmaker analogy. Essentially presented an argument against the idea that complex biological structures could arise without a designer. Creationists basically rebranded this as irreducible complexity. Remember that concept because it's going to come up later. One of the other golden boys on the list is going to be using that one a lot. A guy by the name of Michael Behe. It doesn't really work because we know how evolutionary development happens now, slowly through nothing but natural biological forces and random events. The watchmaker analogy doesn't work when you try to apply it to the gradual development of evolution or living systems, because it's kind of like saying that a sundial couldn't tell time because it doesn't have gears or hands like a clock would, or that a wagon couldn't be used as a vehicle because it doesn't have an engine. It's actually even more ridiculous than that. It's like saying you can't use those designs, the sundial or the wagon, for anything. They're completely useless structures because they don't have all the parts that the most sophisticated version of that structure should have in order to work. And we'll get more into that on Behe because he definitely didn't understand, the giant interconnected pattern of evolutionary and geological science as Paley didn't because he predated them. So grading him on that, again, somewhat unfair. Nevertheless, his ideas just don't work for biological systems. Although they also don't even work as a real way to discern design from non-design. I've never really heard a good rubric for it other than design being basically, can't be explained to my standards by natural processes, which is based on little more than just eyeballing something living and going basically, no way, yeah, this is too complicated. This had to be God. God did it, A lot of people say that as a criticism of creationists. They say that their argument is essentially God did it, which is a little reductive, but also kind of like painfully accurate at the same time. Moving on, the next creationist, high poobah, big, grand, muck-a-muck, big guy, Henry Morris. Morris was a hardcore right-wing evangelical Christian preacher, creationist, apologist through and through. He wrote like 60 books about creationism and evolution and how evolution was evil and satanic conspiracy and all kinds of nutters ideas that still referred to and used to fuel creationism to this day, even though, you know, the scientific community unanimously criticizes these ideas even to this day as well. They've never reversed their position on these ideas being basically crackpot. As far as the fundamentals, Morris somewhat understood fundamentals of evolution, at least enough to write 60 books about it, right? I mean, if you can write 60 books about a subject, you must understand the fundamentals of it a little bit, right? Well, like I said, the books are not great. He's a biblical inerrantist who believed the Earth was literally 6,000 years old. He argued with radiometric dating during basically his entire life as a creationist, so we can assume what his position on the heat problem would be, which is basically deceiver or devious God, which we know that doesn't really work. It's a self-devouring argument, and even if it doesn't self-devour, it doesn't work because there's too much heat. For reasons I hope to get into in my own videos about the heat problem, thank you so much again, Erica, aka Gutsick Gibbon, for introducing me to this. I don't know how I had never heard of this. Should be everybody's first introduction to young Earth creationism. Is they should the first thing they should learn is the heat problem. It's like learning modern physics without knowing about the mass of the universe problem. Like it's sure, like string theory is more useful than, you know, creationism by far, but it has this big problem, and that's a big part of why, you know, it's still highly theoretical. Creationism is not only theoretical because of this problem, it's outright precluded. But I'm digressing. We'll nerd out about the heat problem a little bit more later. Back to grading Morris. I would rate him on the fundamentals somewhere around needs improvement if I'm trying to be really unbiased, but honestly, I think he's an outright womp womp. As far as scientific evidence, Morris was terrible on evidence. He was shaky even on the concept of what evidence is or why evidence is more viable than myths. The whole point of biblical inerrancy is that when evidence conflicts with biblical interpretation, then evidence is wrong and just testing your faith, basically. As I've explained before, you know, most creationists accept that evolution has happened now. Nowadays, they just quibble about how much speciation can produce changes based on nothing but their own personal incredulity, usually. That's why creationism has mainly 4 ideologies, 3 of which are also at war with the most extreme one, along with the rest of, you know, the atheistic scientists that they claim are the dominating force behind what's contradicting their ideas, which is, no, they're wrong. It's other Christians. There's the YECs, the young Earth creationists. They're the super conservatives like Morris. There's old Earthers who are slightly more scientific and, you know, tend to try to hide God away in other unknown gaps in science. Intelligent design types who I still strongly opine are just creationists, but instead of outright saying God made everything, they say an intelligence. But when they say an intelligence designed everything, they're talking about their God. And then there's theistic evolutionists, most of whom aren't even arguing with people about evolutionary and geological science online and never will in their God-blessed, beautifully ignorant lives, instead of sitting on their computer talking to people who probably don't want to change their minds about their wrong ideas anyways, like I do, because apparently I just can't help myself or something. But back to grading Morris on evidence, solid needs improvement or a womp womp at best. I mean, he's one of the craziest types of creationists, saying basically everybody of every religion, every PhD, even the Pope, is wrong. On the next category, interconnectedness, Morris did not understand or accept truly undeniable aspects of evolutionary and geological science, like the very old age of the Earth, let alone the rest of the pattern. Anybody arguing a young age of the Earth is a little bit kooky in my view, because there's just so much evidence from disparate means of inquiry that contradicts it. I mean, dendrochronology, volcanology, radiometry, so many things. The heat problem, the mud problem, the food problem, so many problems, as well as, contradicting evidence, as well as collusionary problems. Morris spent a lot of time railing against radiometry because it's one of the means of getting the old age of the planet. He gets a solid womp womp in this category. Pretty much all creationists score very poorly in this category. They rarely respond to evolutionary and geological science as the huge interconnected pattern it is. Most don't even understand that huge pattern. It's a big part of why their arguments fall so flat and fail ubiquitously. For instance, they love saying things like, billions of years can't make an ant an elephant, or speciation can't make a lizard or bird. But they never put those two things together, like, it's not just billions of years, it's billions of years while this process is happening. Many, many millions of speciations which produce changes, but also preserve some levels of basal similarity. There was multiple times where, I have a creationist making this billions of years argument, and I point out, it's not just billions of years, it's billions of years in the process. And then they just make the argument again. I got to the point where I stopped, actually pointing out, you're still really not you got to multiply the products. You're not doing the correct equation and saying, well, you can't get this product. But you're only saying that because you aren't multiplying the actual products. But it got to the point where I just counted how many times you can point out it's not just billions of years, it's billions of years in the process. I've had my records like 14 times. 14 times before somebody finally went, okay, well, it's not just the billions of years, it's the billions of years in the process. Most of the times they don't even admit that. They just keep doing it over and over again and ignore you or go silent. But yeah, Morris made that kind of argument as well, and creationists still do, and that gets them the womp womp. Usefulness. This is another category where pretty much all the creationists are going to score womp womp very poorly. Creationism isn't good for anything. It's good for absolutely nothing. Creationists, when they do good things in their lives, it's never while using creationism. Like if you're a creationist who's a dentist and you're out scraping molars and helping people be healthy, that's great. But dentistry doesn't depend on creationism at all. You're being a good person despite being a creationist. And I bet when you're being a creationist, you're probably not that great. I probably wouldn't like you that much. But anyways, those are my biases. I'll explain this more in depth in later videos. Creationism doesn't produce. It doesn't do robust endeavors. The only robust endeavors creationism does is posting tortured nonsense online, selling books full of pseudoscience, and they got a ridiculous museum built with taxpayer dollars that depicts humans and dinosaurs riding on a magic boat through a genocidal superstorm together. Morris has been pivotal to all these endeavors and creationism's true biggest endeavor, perpetuating an insane subversive culture war against science, geology, evolution, and what they call atheistic materialist communism. Anyone who does only this or anything less on this list, in my opinion, they're going to get a solid womp womp for usefulness. That shit is not useful in any way. It's just ginning up paranoia. It's just making people crazy. It's like you see pictures of their Ark Encounter Museum, and they've got, all this war going on Christian identity, and they put evolution next to things like pornography, adultery, moral decay, divorce. Like, evolution has nothing to do with these other four things. It's all moral panic bullshit. It's the same stuff they used in the 60s and 70s to make people terrified of gay people and Satanists and Dungeons and Dragons and other awesome things that fundamentalists are terrified of. Moving on, continue resuming. Yeah, I keep digressing here. It's an interesting topic. There's a lot to talk about on it. That's why I'm going to kind of take my time a little bit with publishing videos. Grading Morris on critical thinking. Morse did a lot of thinking about creationism, but not much about evolutionary science, except when he was trying to figure out, how he could support his presumed conclusion about evolutionary science. I don't think you could handle a single debate with a modern scientist on evolutionary and geological science. I don't think any creationist can. They think they implode pretty much completely. He would definitely implode on the heat problem because, like I said, he argued with radiometry his whole life. There's no way he'd be able to handle the heat problem, let alone empirical experimental evolution. The next category, though, this is one category where creationists are somewhat beating scientists. Scientists mostly ignore creationists. That's the engagement category, Creationists, however, they'll debate anybody. They'll debate over and over about the subject because every debate is an opportunity to evangelize. Science doesn't have a real directive to evangelize. It just tests our understanding of reality continually. Scientists are mostly indifferent to the common creationists, rejecting the consensus, the literature, peer review, the geologic column, genetic evidence, molecular phylogeny, on and on and on and on. Scientists, they're not going to go knocking on people's doors and trying to get them to believe in evolution. Although I've certainly heard many creationists, including Morris, make the ridiculous claim that evolution is a religion. Evolution just teaches the data and lets people decide for themselves. If they want to, they can see its validity and try to contribute to it, developing it. And if they don't, they can try to disprove it. Creationists have tried, but they've never succeeded at doing the latter. So creationists take a lot of debates, but they do poorly. They'll be getting mostly needs improvements on this list, even if they take a lot of debates. And those who take few or no debates and do poorly get the old womp womp. Morris is one of the former. On the miscellaneous, though, huge womp womp. Womp womp to the max. Morris, like many creationists, will have this same womp womp. They admit their prima facie presumption, dogmatic assumption of its correctness, and unwillingness to change their ideas in response to the evidence they haven't yet learned. Some of you who are more familiar with the subject might remember, Ken Ham and Bill Nye having the debate, and what they concluded the debate with was a round of questioning. And one of the last questions they got asked was, what would change your mind? To which Bill Nye said, evidence, show me some evidence and I'll change my mind. And Ken Ham replied bluntly, nothing. Nothing will change my mind. That's a huge womp womp in the miscellaneous. It's a huge admission of bias is what that is. So that gets a solid womp womp. And I think that actually applies to every creationist on this list, although most of them won't say it overtly at least, as Morris did. So it made it into his actual miscellaneous category. So we'll move on to the next one now. Gish. Dwayne Tolbert Gish. Oh, man. One of, if not the biggest of the big boys of modern creationism, alongside Behe. I regret not getting to meet this guy before he died. I always wanted to ask him to his face if he actually believed the solid rock of the Grand Canyon was bored by a global deluge. Why didn't it erode away all the rock around there and only the area around the river? I'm sure other people asked him that. I don't think he ever found an answer, but he's still looked up to this day by creationists, nevertheless. In the fundamentals, Gish had a PhD in biochemistry, a subject which pretty much every modern expert at the top of that field or leaders in related industries, they accept evolutionary and geological science overwhelmingly, 99.99999%. I'd say it's probably even higher than that. I could probably find more people in those fields named Steve who accept evolutionary science than you can find creationist ones. But while he was in this field, but I think he's just one crackpot who rejects it, along this overwhelming majority of people who accept it, even though he somehow understood biology enough to get a doctorate in a fairly relevant field of life science. Of course, he and all the creationists on this list have never done any real research or scientific work challenging evolutionary theory or geological science, which the latter is ironically what he spoke about most throughout his career, even though he was an alleged expert in the former. He talked mostly about geology, even though he was a biochemistry PhD. Yeah, you see this a lot in the creationism camp. People talking about disciplines other than their own, which is weird because sometimes their own discipline is in an actually relevant field. Their testimony on that subject would be more credible, but for some reason they talk about it completely. For some reason, we'll see if you can figure out what that is. His grasp of the fundamentals could range in grading from needs improvement to developing. If we're very harsh and critical, or at best he's somewhat proficient if we're being really liberal. This is partly because, he spoke more about geology than his real expertise. That's why he should get, needs improvement to an outright womp womp, because he's a biologist talking about geology, and his comments on geology are freaking terrible. But, because he understood some of the fundamentals of evolution, rare not a womp womp maybe on the creationist list here. But still, you must be thinking by now, as I do often, with how poorly all these guys understand the facts that they're arguing, why is this still a debate? It's the right-wing culture war. I'm going to talk about that a lot more in other videos. But moving on with grading Gish, next, scientific evidence. Gish was convinced that evolution was a farce or a hoax of some kind by one pamphlet, basically. He joined an organization of Christian scientists because he thought they were creationists, and then he found out, nope, not at all, just Christian scientists, the vast majority. I find that hilarious. Like, if you're going to join a group over a key issue, you really ought to make sure that group agrees with you on a key issue. Like, what a womp womp. Oh, but, and the fact that he pivoted his entire life trajectory over one pamphlet. I get pamphlets that are dreck, absolute pablum, and I can imagine the pamphlet he got was not that different from those kinds of pamphlets. And he based his whole life, I don't know what else to call that. It's a major womp womp. For interconnectedness, you would think as a biochemist who spoke mostly about geology in his capacity as a young Earth creationist evangelist, that Gish would have had a better grasp on the interconnectedness of evolutionary and geological sciences. But of course, it's the exact opposite. Rather than seeing, the intricate pattern and how it all supports or confirms other parts of itself through disparate means, Gish just saw lots of ideas to attack as a rhetorical tactic. You probably have heard the tactic named after him. That's going to be in his miscellaneous category. Spoiler alert, but rather, he didn't produce a lot of arguments that showed he had a working understanding of the interconnected evolutionary idea, but rather he had the typical straw man version of science, like most creationists do, needs improvement, or even womp womp would be perfectly fair grades. Usefulness. Gish's legacy is young Earth creationism. Institute of Creationist Research probably wouldn't still exist if not for him. AIG wrote an article about how pivotal he was to the movement. I don't know if he ever produced any biochem research that wasn't related to, creationism via evolution. Certainly, it's not what he'll be remembered for. He's remembered for something completely different. And I have a tendency, he was a professor in a research position at a Christian university for many years, but creationist research has an interesting tendency to not involve a lot of actual researching, so that really actually doesn't surprise me much. Solid womp womp. Critical thinking. Gish's problem wasn't critical thinking as much as other creationists, perhaps, but more presuppositionalism, which is a difficulty all creationists are impeded by. Gish focused most of his critical thinking on rejecting evolution and on being perceived as the T.H. Huxley of creationism. That's a nickname he wore proudly. It basically meant he focused on making arguments against the science he didn't want to accept instead of thinking critically and impartially about the evidence, is what I mean. His nickname meant, he was a full-throated bulldog. He was like, because remember, Huxley was called Darwin's bulldog. He wanted to be creationism's bulldog. He didn't want to accept things, and so he didn't think critically about them that way. He thought critically about how to, hand wave them, to ignore them. And a lot of his hand waving arguments are still very popularly used by creationists today. Gets the old womp womp. Engagement needs improvement, not because of a lack of debates. Gish, like many creationists on this list, was a very active debater. Like I said, he relished being perceived as creationism's Huxley. He took many debates, and he was undiscouraged from taking debates when, after taking several debates, several of the people who debated him wrote extensively about his bad behavior as a debate adversary. That's where, the famous Gish Gallop comes from, one of those critical writings. Other people wrote critically about how he didn't respond to arguments that challenged his ideas and mostly just ignored them. He loved going to colleges and taking debates so he could evangelize to the student body. Creationists still use this tactic today. Creationists focus on debates with a big audience of lay people, less than, taking their ideas to the scientific community to be debated there. Wonder why. However, even in these debates, they generally perform extremely poorly, in my opinion. Most of them use all the same or very similar, perilously flawed arguments, and Gish was no exception. He's been a big reason for the longevity of creationism and lots of other forms of science denial. He kind of signaled to them how to do this thing they all do, where they take debates and they debate very hard and they try to be intimidating and forceful, and they fail terribly. They get humiliated by scientists, by people who actually know what they're talking about, and they just ignore it. It just beads up and rolls right off of them. They're like, I didn't lose that debate. They'll even claim they won after getting, an embarrassing defeat. And these debate tactics have been embraced by all kinds of people with extreme fringe beliefs, such as, what I'm going to name in the miscellaneous column here, the Gish Gallop, a whole rhetorical tactic named for him, associated with specious, long-winded rants, and that conjure up images of giant walls of text posted by crackpots that seemingly have more errors and inconsistency than they even have letters somehow. I mean, talk about a womp womp. So as you can probably see, huge founding figures in the creationist movement had or have deeply inadequate understandings of interconnectedness of science. These are some of the best and most important I could find and rate. Bigger names you might know personally will score even worse, and some get womp womps in every category, like Kent Hovind or Ray Comfort. Now, Austin, you might be saying, you're sounding kind of biased. All these big muck-a-muck creationists, and you say they suck at the science. Well, that's because they do, but okay, fair enough. Let's see if I can find some creationists to give some good grades to. We'll start with Behe. Michael Behe is probably the most powerful creationist in the world today. Young Earth, Old Earth, and especially intelligent design types, they all love him. They cite him constantly. They use his arguments and ideas ad nauseum all over the internet. Behe's whole career can be defined by two words, basically: irreducible complexity. We spoke about that earlier. When it comes to irreducible complexity, Behe is its most famous popularizer. I mean, it's not an idea he came up with. It's just Paley's watchmaker argument with a modern coat of sciencey sounding paint slapped on it. But it depends who you ask. Other people will say he's its most famous propagandizer. Infamous, rather. On the grading curve, though, like for the fundamentals, Behe's a surprising special exception. Despite being an intelligent design guy, which I still think is basically just a creationist, although in Behe's case, he's probably at least an old Earth one, which is better than a full-on YEC-ster, because those guys are basically nut jobs, which I say with a lot of sympathy and care more than derision. You guys were mostly tragically misled by people you should have been able to trust. But I digress. Despite being an ID proponent, and perhaps the ID proponent, Behe is a professor of biochemistry. However, there's a bit of controversy there. The word, according to Bundy, is Behe basically never revealed he was a creationist, intelligent design proponent, let alone so full-throatedly advocated for it until after he had tenure. Then, once he had tenure, started writing and selling books wholesale, challenging major aspects of science like Darwin's Black Box and some of his other books that didn't do quite as well. These books were challenging major aspects of the science he himself was trusted by the institution to be a solid authority in, which is generally considered an abuse of the tenure system. You might not be surprised to learn. We'll talk more about those things in his miscellaneous rating probably. But in the fundamentals rating, surprisingly, he gets a proficient. On scientific evidence, Behe's main argument is one I hear constantly parroted by people who utterly lack skill and familiarity with the scientific evidence supporting evolutionary and geological science, which is peculiar because, he himself, again, scores a pretty decently proficient score in this category. He's a biochem professor. He's learned enough about the evidence to pass tests about and to test other students on it. Although I can't speak to the quality of students, I would love to talk to some. I can, however, speak to the quality of Gould students, which is exemplary, and Gould students have criticized Behe a lot. Interconnectedness. Again, Behe's argument stinks on interconnectedness, but he himself, he's a professor, so therefore, again, he's most likely passed tests that would require some knowledge of or proficiency with the interconnectedness in order to succeed on those tests. He's an intriguing guy, to say the least. Usefulness, though, as much as he's one of the creationists I like more than others, I have to give him a womp womp here. His ideas are as useful as most other creationist ideas, which is to say, not very, if at all. They pretty much only generate book sales and donations for creationists. Critical thinking. This is an area where Behe is not scoring so well. During Kitzmiller versus Dover, Behe got slammed repeatedly for not responding to criticism of his ideas. Nevertheless, compared to other creationists who mostly get hard, solid womp womps, it doesn't really feel fair to give Behe a full-on womp womp in this category. We're going to give him special treatment. Like I said, we're using the kid gloves to get some nice, good, fair gradings for some creationists here, and we'll give him a needs improvement, but on the poor side of needs improvement. Engagement. Another irony with Behe is that while Behe destroys other creationists in like proficiency in the scientific evidence, interconnectedness, general scientific acumen, actual, CV, in quite a few other categories, he scores really poorly on this one. Needs improvement at best, to be sure. He doesn't take debates generally, and the few times he has, it's gone notoriously badly. For instance, in the Dover trial, I actually felt embarrassed for him. He was forced to concede he hadn't read even a single paper out of something like 58 different papers challenging his claim of irreducible complexity in the bacterial flagellum. That would get most people a womp womp, but like I said, I'm trying to be my nicest here. Still, I think the creationist experts aren't shaking out so well, you might notice. Miscellaneous. Behe has spent so much time championing irreducible complexity, it might as well be synonymous with his name by now, even though it was basically Paley's idea, as previously stated. However, all the scientific evidence shows his brainchild to be little more than a canard. Like those 58 papers of his irreducibly complex bacterial flagellum, some of them showed that his irreducible complex bacterial flagellum, there were versions of it that had less than 20% of the parts he claims you absolutely need to have a working flagellum. It's pretty hilarious. Getting proven that wrong 58 times over is pretty embarrassing. I'm going to give him a needs improvement here again, and I think it's pretty generous to do so. So, yeah. That's trying to give one of your guys a nice grade. So now I'm going to pivot and find a way to be nicer to you, and it's because I'm going to include a whole new special category, one that I think only two creationists, at least that I know of, really fit into. They are an extremely rare kind of creationist, the kind who A, knows at least a little bit of science, and B, possesses some shred of intellectual honesty. And those creationists are Todd Wood and Kurt Wise. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about these two and why I think they deserve their own category. What makes them special. And that's because they both have strong scientific acumen, enough to understand why evolution is, at least societally, the stronger position. And they have honestly written about their reasons for embracing creationism anyways. And I think a good way to show you what I mean is to quote some of their own writings for you. So we'll start with Todd. He wrote a blog post that is probably the best piece of creationist writing I have ever read. It's pretty concise, actually, so I'm just going to read almost the whole thing here. I'm quoting Todd here. Begin quote. Evolution is not a theory in crisis. It is not teetering on the verge of collapse. It has not failed as a scientific explanation. There is evidence for evolution, gobs and gobs of it. It is not just speculation or a faith choice or an assumption or a religion. It is a predictive framework for lots of biological research, and it has amazing explanatory power. There is no conspiracy to hide the truth about the failure of evolution. There has really been no failure of evolution as a scientific theory. It works, and it works well. I say these things not because I'm crazy or because I've converted to evolution. I say these things because they are true. I'm motivated this morning by reading yet another clueless, well-meaning person pompously declaring that evolution is a failure. We can agree to disagree about them being well-meaning, Tom. I don't think they are, but that's very generous of you to imply that they are. People who say that are either unacquainted with the inner workings of science or unacquainted with the evidence for evolution. Technically, they could also be deluded or lying, but that seems rather uncharitable to say. Oops. Okay, so Todd kind of admits, yeah, maybe they aren't so well-meaning. There in that little parenthetical. Going back to quoting him. Creationist students, listen to me very carefully. There is evidence for evolution, and evolution is an extremely successful scientific theory. That doesn't make it ultimately true, and it doesn't mean that there could not possibly be viable alternatives. It is my own faith choice to reject evolution because I believe the Bible reveals true information about the history of the earth that is fundamentally incompatible with evolution. I am motivated to understand God's creation from what I believe to be a biblical creationist perspective. Evolution itself is not flawed or without evidence. Please don't be duped into thinking that somehow evolution itself is a failure. Please don't idolize your own ability to reason. Faith is enough. If God said it, that should settle it. Maybe that's not enough for your scoffing professor or your non-Christian friends, but it should be enough for you. There's a lot to unpack. The first thing to unpack is I practically want to get up and, give this man a standing ovation. Todd had massive cojones to write this while being a creationist. That first paragraph, evolution's not a theory in Christ, not teetering on the verge of collapse, not a failed scientific explanation, evidence for evolution. It's not speculation, not a faith choice, not an assumption, not a religion. There's been no conspiracy to hide its failure. All of that stuff is direct negation of things I hear constantly from creationists. They repeat all of those, that evolution's a religion, that it's failed, that it's going to be replaced any day. They repeat these lies constantly. If I had a nickel for every time I heard evolution is a religion, I would be an extremely rich man off just a few creationists I specifically interact with alone. This is peak honesty for a creationist. So many creationists tell it like it's the exact opposite of everything Todd just said, and he got a lot of flack and friendly fire from other creationists for doing it. Also, those last paragraphs, I am motivated to understand God's creation from what I believe to be a biblical creationist perspective. That is a huge admission of bias. I'm sure that's not how Todd meant it, but to me it was validating because Yes, that's what I see. I see people who are presuming their conclusion, who are taking this Bible, taking their creationist perspective, and trying to fit the facts to that presupposed conclusion. And Todd is kind of admitting here, yeah, that's kind of what we're doing. And that was very validating for me the first time I read that. Now, some words from Wise. To provide some context, the experts I want to share come from his personal testimony in 6 days. He speaks first about his childhood ambition, where other boys wanted to be astronauts or firemen. Young Kurt dreamed of getting a PhD from Harvard and teaching science at a major university. What an auspicious goal, right? He achieved the first part of his goal, but he became increasingly uneasy as his scientific learning conflicted with his religious faith, unsurprisingly. When he could bear the strain no longer, he decided, he was going to figure it out. He took a Bible and a pair of scissors. He went through from Genesis 1 to Revelations 22, cutting out every verse that he reasoned would have to go if the scientific worldview were true. And at the end of this exercise, there was so little left of the Bible that, quoting Ray here, or Kurt, sorry, I don't know why I keep wanting to call him Ray Wise. I think that's a character in a Stephen King novel that I'm getting confused with, maybe. Anyways, Kurt here, quoting him, try as I might, and even with the benefit of intact margins throughout the pages of Scripture, I found it impossible to pick up the Bible without it being rent in two. I had to make a decision between evolution and Scripture. Either the Scripture was true and evolution was wrong, or evolution was true and I must toss out the Bible. It was there that night that I accepted the Word of God and rejected all that would ever counter it, including evolution. With that, in great sorrow, I tossed into the fire all my dreams and hopes in science. Womp, womp. I mean, come on. How tragic is that? He starts off wanting to be a PhD professor and having all of this gumption, and ends with, in great sorrow, I toss into the fire all my dreams and hopes. This is part of why I think it's worth fighting against creationism. Creationism is cruel to the people who believe in it. And Kurt Wise, you are an example of how cruel creationism is to its own adherents. And I would hope someday you process that and do some healing and realize that you don't have to throw your dreams into the fire for some old dusty book, man. You have great dreams. Dreams that are way better than a book that's full of incest and genocide. Just my personal opinion. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. Kurt's touching on some very real stuff with these words. See, a lot of the reason fundamentalists freak out so much over evolution is because it is pretty bad for literal interpretation of the Bible. Kurt sees this and accepted it and made himself a visual aid as he assessed the Scripture from that viewpoint. That takes a lot of guts to do, and he came to the conclusion that he was most terrified of. That takes a lot of bravery, and I have a lot of admiration right until he throws his dreams in the fire. Then it just all turns to pity. I mean, but yeah, he's seeing this as he assesses the Scripture from that viewpoint. If evolution is true, no Adam and Eve, no Garden of Eden, no original sin, no need for the sacrificial lamb, no Noah, no flood. It's like a domino effect, toppling over more and more of inerrantist fundamentalism with each Bible story that it dashes to the ground. So how do you cope with it if you want to keep believing in God and not seem like a silly person who denies science? Most people would say just accept the science and accept that the Bible has large parts that are completely symbolic at best. Do that, Kurt. Don't burn your dreams. Accept that the Bible is symbolism. Come on. All of the theologians do this pretty much. It's a really, really extreme minority of super conservative ones that don't. But Wise says that's not good enough for him, almost outright. He says, basically, if I'm going to have to toss out the Bible or accept big parts of it are symbolic at best, or accept science, which is my dream, I'm going to let my dreams burn to dead ashes in the fireplace. They're both in a roundabout way kind of admitting to something creationists rarely admit to, and usually only when pressed. Like Ken Ham said famously in his debate with Bill Nye when asked what would change your mind. He said point blank, nothing. This is the biggest miscellaneous womp womp basically every creationist on this list shares, although most of them won't admit to it. Nothing will change their minds. I think Wood and Wise are admitting this, albeit pretty tacitly, in these two pieces of writing I'm referencing here. And that's something people need to know before they hear the creationist arguments, before they hear all their pseudoscience and nonsense ad nauseum, before that stuff assaults their senses. Because to them, they're hearing somebody who's open to ideas. They're hearing somebody who, they have reasonable standards. They need to know that the people claiming they have this knowledge are rigid and unwilling to change their position on if they actually have that knowledge or not, no matter what. That is a really important factor that not a lot of people getting duped into the creationist side of this are assessing this whole thing with. I had to learn it after creationists had spent a long time trying to mindfuck me, which is terrible to go through. It's like being in one of those carnival mazes full of funhouse mirrors. It's like, why are people saying these absurd things to me? Do they actually believe them? Are they actually right somehow, even though it seems completely impossible? And if you're insulated in one of these kinds of groups, I can totally see how you get broken down and indoctrinated. Ken Ham, Todd Wood, and Kurt Wise, they had no idea what a golden key / magic bullet it was for me to hear admitted. What will change my mind? Absolutely nothing. Wise and Wood's word made it clear that attitude is extremely pervasive among creationists, and there are few in their own camp who recognize it, which is huge. And this is one of the main reasons I wanted to grade both sides for you and culminate by talking about these guys, because they are the rare honest ones who admit, yeah, most of the rest of the people in my camp are full of it. And that's ultimately my thesis, is that there really is no debate. Evolution won. So why is it a debate? Indoctrination. Simple. Consciously choosing belief over science and facts because choosing the latter seems inconvenient or untenable to the individual, usually for theological reasons that, again, have nothing to do with science and fact. That's a huge part of why the debate has gone on this long and why there are so many arguments that apologists have created to attack evolution. Most of them, like Wise, are trying to keep their view of the Bible from falling apart. Not understand if they're actually correct or not, I'll be talking a lot more about this, about not just creationism, but the psychology, I believe outright pathos, of many creationists themselves with more videos. I think it's really useful for those future discussions to establish this idea now of the presuppositional inerrancy most creationists are operating under to some degree. So that's basically the video. This is a good setup for some future video ideas I had. I wanted to do a couple of videos going through a comprehensive index of creationist claims and arguments. Somebody in a comment on one of my previous videos said I should address the arguments. You're right. Will do. Challenge accepted. A video talking about the usefulness of the competing concepts. Like I talked about earlier, I wanted to talk about how, I can touch briefly on evolution. Every single robust endeavor in science and reality is based on evolution. Agriculture, conservation, pest retardants, medicine, academia, public health and safety. Like everything is based on evolutionary and geological science. Resource location and control. Like I'm going to make that should be a video all on its own, because evolutionary and geological science have revolutionized our world in so many ways, and creationism does nothing but post torture nonsense online, funnel money to people like Ken Ham and Ken Hovind, and they got a ridiculous museum built. I'm going to talk more in future videos about creationist debate tactics, which we kind of touched on those a little bit in this video, but we're going to dive deep into it. That actually could probably be a couple of videos as well, like a couple of videos going through the index of creationist claims. And all these videos that I want to do in the future, and this one, an idea to emphasize that underpins these videos is that creationism's main endeavor is arguments. Creationism is doing exactly what it wants to be doing if lots of people who believe creationism are arguing with other people about it. The dream scenario is that through these arguments they get new recruits, but even if they don't, it helps spread their ideas. They get to evangelize the people they think most need evangelizing to, and it keeps the people that they already have their hooks in from getting wise, pun intended, and leaving. So perhaps my sign off should be, take the hooks out and leave, creationists. There's a wide, wide world of wonder and curiosity waiting for you outside your bubble. Reality can be a very beautiful thing.